Hi, I'm Callie Storie, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Menil Drawing Institute, and I speak with curators Katy Rogers and Edouard Kopp about the exhibition Robert Motherwell Drawing, As Fast as the Mind Itself. Now for Art This Week. Hi, I'm Callie Storie, and I'm at the Menil Drawing Institute today speaking with Katy Rogers of the Daedalus Foundation about the exhibition Robert Motherwell Drawing, As Fast as the Mind Itself. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to talk about the exhibition.
Of course, me too. I'm going to speak with Edouard Kopp in a bit about the works in the exhibition, so I thought you and I could talk more personally about who Motherwell was and also your work on the Catalog Raisonné project. To set the stage, the earliest works in the exhibition are from the 1940s. Motherwell had just landed in New York after living on both the East and the West Coast and traveling a bit. What informed his artistic practice during these early years?
Of course. So Robert Motherwell was one of the leading spokesmen and artists of the abstract expressionists. So he was born in 1915, which put him on the younger end of that generation that really transformed American art and brought abstraction to the forefront of our cultural consciousness here in the States. Motherwell was a big proponent of modernism, that sensibility of modernism as the experience of the moment that we live in, not trying to look to the past, but really accessing who we are and expressing who we are in the time that we live in. So he was really at the cutting edge of so many of those things here in America. He was born on the West Coast in Aberdeen, Washington, spent most of his childhood in various places along in the West, Utah and California, went to Stanford. His father, like many parents of artists, wanted him to pick a more practical career and suggested he become a philosophy professor. And so he did some philosophy graduate work at Harvard. He never finished the philosophy degree there, but he is very grounded in the philosophical understanding of the world, which informs a lot of his work too. And then he came to New York in the early 1940s, right at the time that many surrealist artists and other European artists were, of course, in exile during World War II. So Motherwell benefited from that as well. And it's really amazing because to have come from this academic background to then transform himself into such an important leading figure within one of really the first international American movements is amazing. He had his first exhibition at Peggy Guggenheim's Art of the Century in 1944, and from there, he's been a part of the public imagination ever since.
I'm sure you've been able to read a lot of Motherwell's personal writings over the years since you authored both of his Catalog Raisonnés. What have you gathered about who Motherwell was as a person, a friend, a colleague?
That's a great question. And I think a lot of times we artists become untouchable. There's a myth around an artist, and it's been a real privilege and a pleasure to be able to get to know someone so intimately through archival correspondence, through oral histories, and also through meeting many people who knew Motherwell as well, who've been very generous in sharing their impressions of him. My understanding of him is that he was extremely generous-minded with his studio assistants, his friends, other artists and students. But at the same time, he was a very introspective person. His studio practice was really private, as it can be for many artists. But he would work in the evening. So he liked his solitude and he needed that for his creative practice. But later in his life, he also had more studio assistants who would work with him. And they often talk about his generosity in working through their own artistic practice. He had musicians and painters working in the studio, and he loved to talk about poetry and music and literature especially. So he was widely read, very interested in things outside of his own artistic practice and how those things intersected with it. But my understanding is he was a little bit shy. But he was also had very strong convictions about what he was doing and why it was important to be an artist.
So Motherwell was probably best known as a painter, but as this exhibition shows, drawing was a major aspect of his life's work. Can you tell me what role drawing took on in his artistic practice?
It's really interesting. So Motherwell is known as a painter, and the abstract expressionists, they were those artists in those enormous lofts in New York City in the 60s. So he has these monumental paintings, and that's what many of us see in exhibitions, museum collections. That's that public face of it. And drawing in its nature, its materiality is much more intimate. So this exhibition is a really unique opportunity to access this very, very special part of his oeuvre. And the drawings, if you look at the major paintings, there's always elements of drawings to them. Some of the drawings that you see in the exhibition, the open drawings, reflect into the open paintings, which are just simple charcoal drawings on fields of color, but at much larger scale. So Motherwell himself had difficulty defining what a drawing was, which I find really interesting. He didn't like the idea that we would separate all of these parts of his practice. He felt that they were deeply, deeply interconnected. And for him, the works on paper were often just as strong as his paintings. And I think you see that here, with the works behind you as well, seeing them together as a group. I think the context of the drawings is so important, and you rarely have the opportunity to see them together.
Well, speaking of the works behind me, I do want to talk about Lyric Suite for a minute. This series alone represents about a third of the drawings in his catalog raisonné. Can you tell me a little bit more about what makes this series so special?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, there are about 1,400 drawings in the catalog raisonné, and about 550 of them are the Lyric Suite. So just in sheer number, they are an important part of our understanding of Motherwell's practice. They also reflect a sort of synthesis for him of his earliest impulses with regard to psychic automatism, where you're trying to access your innermost subconscious, and through that really access authentic feeling, and express that to an outside audience. So this would be to sort of work without preconception and without modification. Motherwell always started canvases with that, but he always modified them almost without fail. But these works are some of the few works in his body of work where you actually see the automatic impulse that remains. He also talks about the artistic medium as one of the most, the only thing in human existence that matches the richness of human emotion. And here it's this collaboration between his medium, the ink on the paper. So he would make the marks, and then the paper would collaborate with him. And he talks about it that way. And here it's really on view, where as the ink spread throughout the paper, Motherwell couldn't control it. It's a very specific type of paper that's extremely absorbent, even more so than other papers that he used. So you have the automatic impulse, you have the deep relationship to the artistic medium, but you always also have the influence of other artists in his life. So he talks about Helen Frankenthaler, his wife at the time, and David Smith, a sculptor who was a very close friend of the couple during the 50s and 60s during their marriage. Motherwell talks about spending so much time with them in the 60s and how their fecundity, as he says, really inspired him. So you can see that there's a deep fecundity in making 550 drawings. And another thing that's amazing about them is he made them over the course of just a few weeks. in the spring of 1965. And he was using it as an exercise to prepare for a larger painted commission. And that was a way to sort of loosen himself up and capture again the idea of an authentic gesture. It was for a mural for John F. Kennedy, the federal building in Boston. So it's a very sensitive topic and something that he felt he wanted to memorialize Kennedy's life in an authentic way, in a humanizing way. So these were an exercise towards that. And of course, David Smith passed away in May of 1965, and that surprise death in a car accident impacted Motherwell so deeply that he never made any more lyric suites. He had originally set out to make 1,000 of them, but 550 is an incredible body of work.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you so much. And I'm so thrilled to see you here with the work and to come back and see it again next month. It's been such a pleasure to work with the Houston art community and the Menil, and it's been so nice to meet you today.
Thanks to Katy for speaking with us. And now for our interview with Edouard Kopp. Hi, we're here with Edouard Kopp today at the Menil Drawing Institute, speaking about Robert Motherwell drawing as fast as the mind itself. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for coming and visit.
Of course, I'm looking forward to it. So I just spoke with Katy Rogers about Motherwell and also her work on the catalog Raisonné, whose publication coincides with this show. So how is this exhibition curated with that in mind, and what's the Menil's relationship with Robert Motherwell's work?
So about 3 years ago, the Daedalus Foundation reached out to us to inform us that they were working on the volumes of the catalog Raisonné devoted to the drawings. And they asked whether we might be interested in curating a show that would coincide with that publication. And it took us very little time to realize what a great opportunity it was, because my colleagues and I think highly of Motherwell's work. We also have work by him in our collection, but also works that are promised to the Menil. Also, Mr. and Mrs. de Menil met the artist back in the day. So that's why we thought it would be a great idea as a curator, having an early access to the results of their research was very appealing and very exciting. And the reason is that they had figured out where many of the works were located. And so as I started to work on my checklist for the exhibition, I had the best information available, and I was able to borrow works from far and wide. So that really transformed my ability to make a checklist.
So to begin, I want to talk about Motherwell's early works from the 1940s. So through works like Mexican Sketchbook and Kafka's Big Room, you can see Motherwell experiment with figural structure and vibrant color, artistic influences, and finding this harmonious blend between geometric and organic shapes. Could you walk me through his process and how he came to achieve this harmony?
Yes, sure. I mean, the first thing to be said is what the main lesson he learned from the Surrealist. So in the Mexican Sketchbook dates from 41. This is the year where, in a way, he's born as an artist and makes a conscious decision to become a professional painter. And he's in touch, in close connection with major Surrealists, Roberto Matta, Max Ernst, Kurt Seligman. And from them, especially Matta, he learned a key aspect of Surrealism, which is the practice of automatic drawing. And what it is, as he called it himself, or described it himself, pre-conscious doodling. And what he meant by that is that you would, as an artist, you would let your hand and your mind go and really tap into your psyche, but also let chance come into the process, the chance of gesture and the chance of thought. And that's something that really is very visible in the Mexican Sketchbook. Of course, the practice of automatic drawing, unlike what its name might suggest, typically involves a second, more conscious, rational stage which helped the artist turn what might have been a kind of free-flowing web of line into an image. And that's what he did. And when you look through the pages of this incredible sketchbook on loan from the Museum of Modern Art in New York, you see that he built essentially what amount to surrealist landscapes dotted with, often with surrealist looking sculptures. And in the case of Kafka's Big Room, which is about 3 years later from 1944, I think he's exploring something different. Here we see an artist, a young artist who's very ambitious, very aware of avant-garde art, and who's trying to widen his horizon, but also learn from other great masters. And in the case of Kafka's Big Room, he's probably looking at Matisse, also very likely Eugène Delacroix, and who is well known for interiors such as Women of Algiers. So he's looking at modern masters he holds in high esteem, and he's trying to get something from them. And in 1944, he had a show at the Peggy Guggenheim's Art of the Century Gallery in New York, which was an exhibition where he showed many drawings. And the show was reviewed by the famous critic Clement Greenberg. And Greenberg had a very interesting remark. He basically said, look, watch him. He is the future of the American school. But for now, you can still that he's still young and still under the spell of influences. And that's what the 1940s are about. They're about an artist, really feeding on and becoming aware of the best of avant-garde art in Europe and in the US, and trying to find his own style, his own language, his own approach to subject matter.
So you have a few elegies in the show that are behind us, and they are mainly pared down to black and white, circular and rectangular forms that have light brush strokes. Can you talk more about these drawings and how they relate to the paintings, the big iconic monumental paintings that we normally see? Did one influence the other?
That's a very good question. Thank you. First, I think to be said about Motherwell is that he had a very porous understanding of the boundaries of media. He often talked about how when he made a drawing, he might have been influenced by one of his own painting in the space, or if he made a print, it could have been a collage in the space. So he thinks very much, he's interested in motifs, and he's interested in how they can be embodied in different materials and techniques. So that's a very important aspect. I think his drawings are rarely preparatory in a traditional sense for paintings. What comes out quite well on this wall, where we have a few examples of the Elegies from 1948 to well into the 70s, you see that the artist really returns to a motif again and again. And this is, Motherwell is an artist who loves to work in series. And by series, I mean not closed ones where the artist would say, I'm going to paint or draw 10 or 100 and there you go. Rather, for him, the idea of series is something open-ended. And often he doesn't close up his series and says they're finished. He may return to them a few years later. And so at the far left on this wall, we've got Elegy to the Spanish Republic #1. It's the first drawing, the first elegy ever, irrespective of medium. So he got the idea on a sheet of paper as he was trying to illustrate a poem by the poet and critic Harold Rosenberg. And so the image started from a kind of struggle or intense relationship between word and image, and then became a series of its own. Obviously, the big difference typically between the paintings and the drawing is one of scale, because here you can see some of the drawings are really intimate in scale, and as we know, Motherwell's elegies on canvas could be absolutely monumental. And also that had an impact on the process. While you would have been able to make some of these drawings relatively quickly, even if you're in the spell of inspiration. Painting a very large painting takes a lot of time.
And so Motherwell also found a lot of inspiration in Japanese Zen Buddhism and the art of Chinese calligraphy. How did those influences manifest in his work?
I think that as early as the 1950s, one can see that. There's a little painting or drawing on Yuln from the Yale Art Gallery in this room, which shows an early example of that. But I believe that it's a bit late in his career that he fully realizes the potential of these calligraphic approaches. I think what he likes in calligraphy is this idea that when you make a sign, that sign is akin to drawing, but also to writing. And for someone as deeply literary as Motherwell, this had its significance. In terms of the impact on the career, the idea of calligraphy is impactful over several decades of his work. Because in calligraphy, you will work quickly, and you will also tend to leave a lot of negative space. The idea of negative space becomes very crucial, I think, in the second half of the 1960s and the 1970s. And there's one series in the exhibition called The Opens, where Motherwell fully realizes the value, the power of negative space. And here, to backtrack for a second, we have to realize that in the Western tradition of image making or composition, one tends to try and balance positive and negative space. So imagine you want to create a landscape with a house. Well, you'll have a house, and then the space around it, you'll create some kind of landscape, you might have some clouds. So there's an attempt to balance positive and negative space. But with Asian calligraphies, typically, there's a sign that occupies a relatively small part of the surface, and what really the main protagonist in a way is the untouched support, be it painting or vellum or whatever the surface. And that's for him is a big realization, which may seem kind of obvious to people who kind of grow up in the Asian tradition, but for an artist like him, it took him some time to get to that. But the result is that he kind of acquired a kind of new way of making drawing and of thinking space, where space is in a way is already assumed to exist, and you don't have to depict it. And with the opens, what he does essentially is he assumes that his support is already a field, and all he needs to do is to cut through it with some lines to activate it, and then you have an image.
So lastly, I wanted to talk about how literature influenced Motherwell's drawings. So there's a whole sketchbook dedicated to drawings inspired by James Joyce's writings. Can you tell me the story behind that?
Yes, although not specifically, because I think he's rarely an artist who straightforwardly illustrate. He's more into evocation, and often evocation is kind of specified through careful titling. And so there's 8 drawings in a case in the exhibition that are part of the so-called James Joyce sketchbook. And James Joyce, the Irish novelist, was one of his favorites. And the drawings in that sketchbook range from drawings that represent possibly landscapes or buildings in Ireland, but many of the drawings are also purely abstract. But regarding Motherwell's interest in literature, I mean, it goes way back in his own life, even I think before he becomes an artist. Also, I think his love of language was probably sharpened as he studied philosophy at Stanford. He was an extremely well-trained and very bookish artist, very kind of intellectual with a brush. And poetry is also a big part of his inspiration. And he's known to have said that while most artists will be, visual artists will be mostly inspired by visual images, he was as much inspired by literary images as he was by visual images. And so it's, poetry, literature, philosophy, are really a kind of key substrate to his practice.
Great, well that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for joining us and chatting about this exhibition.
You're most welcome, thank you for coming.
One more thanks to Katy and Edouard for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to menil.org. That's it for Art This Week, thanks for watching.
Find all of our videos and sign up for our newsletter at artthisweek.com. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter.